On the 22nd of June, 1941, in the pale, early light of a summer morning, the stillness along the long frontier between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was shattered by the roar of engines and the thunder of gunfire. Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's massive and long-anticipated invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. More than 3 million German soldiers surged across the border in the largest military offensive in human history up to that point. The line of advance stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, covering a distance so vast that events at one end of the front were sometimes unknown hours later at the other. Hitler saw the invasion not merely as a military campaign, but as an ideological war of extermination, a fulfillment of his own writings from the 1920s, in which he argued that Germany's destiny lay in conquering the East. The Soviet Union, in his eyes, was a brittle state, politically corrupt, militarily weak, socially inferior, and it would collapse once struck a decisive blow. That belief formed the foundation of Barbarossa, a belief that would ultimately doom the entire operation. For the first weeks, German optimism seemed justified. The Wehrmacht unleashed a devastating combination of mobility, surprise, and firepower. Panzer divisions, the instrument of Blitzkrieg, sliced through Soviet lines with astonishing speed, often advancing 20 or 30 miles in a single day. Infantry divisions marched behind them, clearing pockets of resistance and securing ground. Overhead, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Within the first 48 hours, German aircraft destroyed thousands of Soviet planes, many caught on the ground before they could even take off. Communications across the Soviet ranks collapsed almost immediately. Entire Soviet armies were swallowed in massive encirclements, their units disorganized, cut off, and often leaderless. At Minsk and Białystok, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were trapped. At Smolensk, a huge pocket closed again around dazed and exhausted Soviet soldiers who had barely understood the extent of the invasion. The speed at which the Germans advanced shocked the world. It even shocked their own commanders. Hitler congratulated himself on having predicted the Soviet collapse so confidently. Everything he had written in Mein Kampf seemed to be unfolding exactly as he had imagined. "Kick in the door," he had promised, "and the whole rotten structure will collapse." During the first weeks of the campaign, it appeared that he might be right. Villages, towns, and cities fell one after another. Soviet divisions disintegrated in the face of relentless pressure. Stalin, stunned by the betrayal of a pact he had signed only 2 years earlier, struggled in the opening days to grasp the scale of the catastrophe unfolding on his western border. And yet, even as the Germans celebrated their early victories, the foundations of disaster were already being laid. The first problem was the vastness of the Soviet Union. The distances involved dwarfed anything the German army had encountered in Poland, Norway, or France. Supply lines grew longer by the day. Fuel trucks struggled to keep pace with the fast-moving panzers. Spare parts and ammunition lagged behind on poorly constructed roads. Captured Soviet railways had to be converted to German gauge before they could be used. Every mile the Germans advanced made supplying their frontline units more difficult. Blitzkrieg, as a method of warfare, required tight coordination between tanks, infantry, supply columns, and air support. By late July, the speed of the advance had outrun the logistics necessary to sustain it. The second problem was the Soviet response. While the Red Army reeled under the shock of the initial assaults, it did not collapse. Instead, Stalin demanded absolute resistance. Units that might have retreated in earlier wars were ordered to stand and fight, regardless of the odds. Soviet soldiers often obeyed because they had no choice. NKVD officers enforced discipline brutally. But there was also genuine patriotism and anger at the invader. The Soviet Union may have been unprepared in June, but it possessed enormous reserves of manpower, industrial capacity, and sheer determination. New armies were raised seemingly overnight. Factories from Leningrad, Moscow, and Kharkov were dismantled and transported by rail to the Ural Mountains, far from German bombers. There, thousands of workers reassembled those factories and began producing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and rifles at a pace that astonished German intelligence analysts. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to underestimate their opponent. They believed the Soviet army numbered around 3 million men. By Christmas of 1941, the Germans had captured roughly 3 million Soviet soldiers. And yet the Soviet army was still fighting with numbers equal to or greater than it had fielded back in June. For German commanders who had expected the campaign to end in 8 weeks, This was bewildering. The Soviets, it turned out, could lose more men in a single week than some countries had in an entire war, and still raise new armies. Despite these warning signs, Hitler pushed his armies deeper. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group South battled for control of Ukraine and its wheat fields, and Army Group Center pushed toward the biggest prize of all, Moscow. Throughout August and early September, German forces advanced steadily, though increasingly slowly. The Soviets fought desperate, delaying actions. Entire divisions sacrificed themselves to buy a few more hours for defensive lines to be prepared farther east. Still, even with Soviet resistance stiffening, the Germans remained confident that a final push could take the Soviet capital. Then came the decision that altered the course of the entire campaign. Hitler, concerned about large Soviet forces still holding out behind the German front, and worried that the Soviet economy might continue functioning as long as Ukraine remained in Soviet hands, ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance and divert its panzer divisions to the north and south. Many German generals protested bitterly, arguing that the road to Moscow was open and that every day lost made the weather more dangerous. But Hitler was unmoved. He wanted Leningrad starved into submission and Ukraine's industrial resources seized. The result was that the German offensive paused at precisely the moment when momentum mattered most. That pause gave the Soviets what they needed most: time. Time to dig new defensive lines. Time to transfer troops from Siberia after confirming that Japan had no intention of attacking the Soviet Far East. Time to move more factories east and increase production. Time to prepare for the battle that Hitler believed would end the war. When the Germans resumed the drive toward Moscow in October, they did so against a Soviet army better organized, better supplied, and more prepared than it had been at any point since June. The Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the offensive meant to capture Moscow before winter. It began with more encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. Once again, the jaws closed. Once again, capitalizing on rapid movement and tactical surprise, German commanders hoped the Soviets had finally reached the breaking point. But as October progressed, the weather turned against the invaders. The autumn rains transformed roads into rivers of mud. Vehicles sank up to their axles. Tanks stalled. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, died in the thousands. Progress slowed to a crawl. German soldiers marched knee-deep in sludge, struggling to move artillery or supply carts forward. When the mud finally froze, the winter arrived with sudden ferocity. Temperatures plunged far below anything the Germans had prepared for. Engines refused to start. Weapons jammed. Boots split. Frostbite sent more soldiers to hospital than enemy bullets. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, many of whom came from Siberia and were trained for winter warfare, fought on with equipment designed for the cold and with a sense of grim determination. By late November, German forces stood within sight of Moscow's suburbs. They could see the city's outer defenses. They could feel the end of the campaign approaching, but they lacked the strength to take the city. Their divisions were exhausted, undersupplied, and freezing. Soviet defenders, reinforced by fresh Siberian troops, held firm. On December 6th, the Soviets counterattacked. Under the command of Marshal Zhukov, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive that hurled the Germans backward along the entire front near Moscow. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were forced into retreat. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The failure came from many causes: the vast distances of the Soviet Union, the logistical difficulties of sustaining a rapid advance, the resilience and industrial capacity of the Soviet state, the brutal Russian winter, and above all, Hitler's catastrophic miscalculations. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. It did not. He believed Germany could fight a short war in the East. It could not. And once the campaign turned into a long war of attrition, Germany lacked the resources to prevail. Barbarossa's failure ensured that the war in the East would become a prolonged, brutal struggle, one that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. The pause Germany imposed upon its own advance proved far more damaging than any Soviet maneuver. While the German armies won additional victories and captured several 100,000 more Soviet soldiers, those brief weeks of hesitation cost them the most valuable resource of all: time. Time for the weather to turn, time for the terrain to transform into a quagmire, and most importantly, time for the Soviet Union to gather its strength for a desperate defense of its capital. Those weeks allowed the Red Army to rebuild some semblance of a defensive line and prepare reinforcements that otherwise would have arrived too late to matter. When Army Group Center finally resumed its push toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, it entered a battlefield changed almost beyond recognition. As the Germans advanced again, they encountered not only fortified Soviet positions, but the onset of the notorious Russian Rasputitsa. Snow fell early, melted, turned to mud, froze overnight, then melted again in an unending and maddening cycle. The roads, the lifelines of the German army, disintegrated. Vehicles sank axle-deep in muck. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, collapsed from exhaustion or became mired and died. Truck engines sputtered and failed. Artillery pieces had to be dragged forward by teams of soldiers slogging through knee-deep sludge. The men who had raced across Western Europe now found themselves crawling forward, each mile won at enormous physical cost. The German army had not prepared for this. Everything about the invasion had been based on finishing the war quickly, on defeating the Soviet Union before autumn turned to winter. Their equipment, clothing, and supply distribution all reflected this assumption. The troops wore thin summer uniforms. Their vehicles used lubricants that thickened in cold weather. Their aircraft engines struggled in the freezing temperatures. The German command had simply not considered the possibility that the war would extend into the Russian winter, a season more formidable than any enemy. Yet the men pressed on. Despite the weather, the German advance continued, slowly but relentlessly. By late November 1941, they had reached the outer suburbs of Moscow. German reconnaissance patrols reported seeing the faint glow of the city's lights on the horizon. Soldiers believed victory was within reach. Many thought the war in the east would be over within days, that they would march triumphantly through Red Square. But beneath this fragile optimism lay a grim reality. The German offensive was exhausted. Panzer divisions had been reduced to half their strength. Many tanks had been lost not to combat, but to mechanical failure. The infantry had marched hundreds of miles with little rest. Supplies were inconsistent at best and non-existent at worst. Air power, once the sharpest edge of the German advance, could no longer operate effectively because the Luftwaffe was worn down after months of unending sorties. The cold became a greater threat than the Red Army. Frostbite ravaged German units with terrifying speed. Fingers, ears, and toes blackened and died. More soldiers were incapacitated by cold injuries than by enemy fire. Weapons jammed as metal parts froze. Oil and lubricants thickened to the consistency of paste. Even starting a vehicle became a monumental task. Fires had to be lit under engines for hours just to warm them enough to turn over. The winter was an enemy for which Germany had neither anticipated nor equipped itself. Despite these catastrophic conditions, Germany still seemed on the brink of victory in Eastern Europe. Army Group North had encircled Leningrad, beginning a siege that would last years and cost hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Army Group South had seized Kiev, captured vast numbers of Soviet prisoners, and occupied some of the most fertile and industrially important lands in the Soviet Union. Army Group Center, though battered, was positioned at the very gates of Moscow. To outside observers, the strategic situation still appeared to favor Germany. Yet this perceived strength was deceptive. The Germans were at the end of their endurance, and the Soviet Union had quietly prepared its response. While the Germans struggled through mud and frost, an immense movement was taking place behind Soviet lines. Train after train rolled westward from Siberia and the Far East. On board these trains were Siberian divisions, well-trained, well-equipped, and conditioned for extreme cold. These troops wore heavy winter uniforms, white camouflage, and carried weapons designed to function in sub-zero temperatures. Their commanders were experienced officers untouched by Stalin's purges, men who understood how to conduct operations in harsh winter landscapes. Stalin risked bringing these divisions west only after learning, through the intelligence provided by Richard Sorge, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. Once assured of this, he redeployed these elite forces to reinforce Moscow. On December 6, 1941, as temperatures plunged far below freezing, the Soviet Union unleashed its counteroffensive. The attack caught the Germans completely off guard. Exhausted, freezing, and stretched impossibly thin, German units were in no condition to withstand a massive, coordinated assault. The fresh Soviet divisions struck with ferocity, pushing the Germans back along the entire front. What had been a broad line of German positions suddenly buckled. Entire sectors collapsed as German units retreated in disarray. Hitler's orders to stand fast were increasingly impossible to obey. Commanders on the ground faced a stark choice: retreat or allow their divisions to be encircled and destroyed. The retreat was chaotic and deadly. German soldiers trudged backward through deep snow, carrying the wounded on improvised sleds or leaving them behind when no other option remained. Vehicles abandoned in the mud weeks earlier now stood frozen in place. Soviet cavalry and ski troops harassed the retreating Germans, exploiting their vulnerability. The German line, which had reached the outskirts of Moscow, was forced back dozens of miles. Villages that had been seized after fierce fighting were lost again. The dream of capturing Moscow evaporated in the icy blasts of the Russian winter. With the failure of this offensive, Operation Barbarossa came to its definitive end. What had been conceived as a lightning-fast campaign to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks had instead devolved into a brutal, protracted conflict that Germany was ill-equipped to fight. Hitler's ideological assumptions had proven disastrously wrong. The Soviet state had not collapsed. The Red Army had not evaporated. Instead, the Soviets had demonstrated a remarkable capacity to endure suffering, mobilize reserves on an immense scale, and relocate entire industries eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. Factories disassembled in Leningrad, Moscow, and Kharkov reappeared in the Ural Mountains and Siberia, continuing to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition with astonishing speed. Germany, meanwhile, now faced a war of attrition, a slow, grinding struggle of manpower and industrial output. This was the type of war the German economy had been designed to avoid. The Wehrmacht excelled in rapid, decisive operations, not drawn-out conflicts against opponents with far greater reserves of men and resources. Yet Barbarossa had transformed the war in the East into precisely such a struggle. Germany could not replace losses as quickly as the Soviet Union, nor could it match the pace of Soviet industrial production once the relocated factories began full operation. The failure of Barbarossa did not immediately end German ambitions. In 1942, seeking to regain the initiative, Hitler launched a new offensive, this time directed toward the oil-rich Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. His generals urged him instead to renew the attack on Moscow, arguing that the Soviet capital remained the most critical strategic objective. But Hitler fixated on oil. Without the fuel from the Caucasus, he believed the German war machine would eventually grind to a halt. What he failed to grasp was that the decisive moment had already passed. By the end of 1941, the possibility of a swift German victory in the East had vanished forever. Operation Barbarossa remains one of the most ambitious and catastrophic gambles in military history. It began with immense confidence, driven by ideology, arrogance, and a belief in the superiority of the German soldier and system. It ended in exhaustion, frostbite, and retreat. The initial German victories were spectacular, but they were not enough. The Soviets refused to collapse, refused to surrender, and refused to concede the fate of their nation. Their resilience, combined with the vast geography of their homeland and the savagery of winter, shattered Hitler's dream of dominion in the East. By the time the snow settled and the front stabilized in early 1942, the fate of the German invasion had already been sealed. The Eastern Front would drag on for nearly 4 more years, becoming a nightmare of attrition, destruction, and unimaginable human suffering. But the turning point, the moment Germany lost the chance for victory, had already come and gone during those critical months outside Moscow in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, conceived as a swift and decisive campaign, ended not with triumph, but with the sobering realization that Germany had awakened an enemy too vast to defeat and too determined to die.